I am Jen Stromston. I'm obviously, maybe not obviously, I'm not Alex Wilson and I'm not Stephen Dodson. Today. And, they were meant to be here, but we are all members of the Ecovation Hub leadership team. We all came into it as parts of different organizations and different pieces of the project as it's evolved. So we've all been kind of on the same journey together, just coming from different directions. I am Jennifer Stromston. I am on the leadership team mostly in my capacity as the staffer for the Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation, which in New England, where we have no county government, always requires explanations for acronyms. So it is sort of like the half of FERCOG that does economic stuff. So in Vermont, there are regional agencies kind of like our COGs and our planning commissions. And sometimes they are together, community and land use and economic development and other things, and sometimes they are separate. Mostly they're separate. So I work in the economic and community development side. And I think what we're going to do is I will sort of do 10 minutes on kind of unpacking how and why the Ecovation Hub got started, because it's kind of, the mechanics of it are kind of interesting, to me at least, and important. And then Sarah's going to talk a bit sort of about where it's going, and then depending on questions, we have some specific examples of things that are going on that we can talk about. We can kind of take it in any direction because it is kind of a starfishy thing.
Yeah, I'm Sarah Canabay, and I'm the Outreach and Communications Manager at the Franklin Community Co-op during my day job hours, amongst other things.
Yeah.
And I'm serving on the Ecovation Hub leadership team in the interest of recognizing that you need a robust, sustainable regional economy in order to make your food cooperative thrive and grow. Like every other small business. But we're also really interested because of the broad nature of our mission statement as a cooperative. We're really interested in regional food hub development and improving and strengthening sustainable food systems throughout the region beyond what we do at our 2 stores. So that's sort of what brought me into this. And then also it was through a connection with GCC. I started a student-led farmers market a couple of years ago to sort of help new farmers get a toehold in a direct sales market, and then it also provided students at GCC in the Farm and Food Systems program an opportunity to run a business. During the summer, they were the market managers, they did all the recruitment, they did all the sales, they took turns working at the different farms for a couple of weeks at a time to get to know the vendors. And the woman who originally oversaw that program here told me about the Ecovation Hub, and then I met all of those people, and now we're all trying to make green business connections throughout our region.
Yep, and in some ways we kind of represent probably 2 really important sides of the Ecovation Hub, which is I tend to focus more on kind of forestry, wood product related things, because that's more where the wheelhouse of my organization sort of falls. Having said that, we also work with a lot of food manufacturers, so it tends to be that sort of at the one end of the farm to table spectrum, there's sort of a whole bunch of folks, and then we tend to be like where you start actually manufacturing like a lot of yogurt or a lot of gluten-free bread or whatever. So where we tend to be
building
more
the table that the farm ends up on.
Building the factory that puts the stuff into the thing kind of thing. So that's we kind of cross over there, but I think it's just important to sort of see that everyone who's at the table for the leadership group is really coming from different pieces, folks who are in from the financial side, folks that are really from green building, so just representing different aspects of sort of the economic systems. So I'm going to sort of start at the beginning, and this is, like when we all tell our life story, we tell it from our own perspective, and we don't tell it from our parents' perspective or our sister's perspective, so take it with a grain of salt. This is from the perspective of my organization and my experience with this, but several years ago, coming out of, frankly, not just some bad years for the ski industry in southern Vermont, but then Tropical Storm Irene, which really wiped out a bunch of towns and their infrastructure. The communities in southern Vermont or southeastern Vermont especially were working on doing something to sort of level up in terms of economic development and community recovery. And they were given permission by the federal government to do an economic plan for the region, which is called a SEDS, and that's typically not something that you do at such a small scale. And so that happened, and that happened with some sort of windfall money from a utility that was willing to pay for something that normally that region couldn't have afforded, just to frankly get some very experienced consultants in to do that and do a pretty robust process. That said, pointed out a couple of things, that process. One, which is that there was, it may seem obvious in saying it, but it kind of substantiated that there was some real advantages in the area economically in terms of the knowledge and expertise around green building and sustainable building and energy. It also pointed out that that nuclear power plant might close. So, and the point was, just to take a look at if you're coming off of a bunch of bad tourism years and you're coming off of some natural disasters driven by climate change, and then you're looking at possibly losing 600 jobs that paid somewhere between 2 to 3 times as much as your typical jobs in the area, what is that? You need to be planning for that. And so what came out of that process was a SEDS that gave some granularity to sort of understand some of the potential advantages in the green building and green and energy sectors, and also said why it was important to try to take advantage of that, which is frankly, which then became real, because it was sort of not announced at that time that VY was going to close, but during that time it was announced. And so one of the things that happened was because the information was on the table about what the economic impact would be. I don't know if you spend much time in Vermont. It's hard to have a conversation in Vermont about VY without it becoming very acrimonious, at least it was at the time. What this did is it sort of pulled out the economic discussion. It's just like, let's just agree that when it closes, this many jobs, this much money leaves the economy. And it's something we could do something about. And so with that information, what happened in Vermont, which was a very unique thing, was that the governor had in hand information about a fairly not well understood and outsized impact event. And so when he went into the closure agreement with the Entergy Corporation, he negotiated what still stands today as the largest settlement for a closure. And so he came out of that agreement with $10 million for economic development for Wyndham, and with $5 million additional towards wood heat, towards a renewable biofuel kind of centered thing. So that long story around how all that played out, but one of the things that came out of that was, okay, well, what next? So what do we do to try to leverage some of this? And basically, we started to form some collaborations around that conversation. We've convened a conversation at Lambert College for the day, and it was the first time there was a breakfast that morning where it was the first time that the heads of the regional agencies in the 3 counties where all of the jobs were that were from Vermont Yankee had gotten together to talk about economics, anything. So those folks have been in the room sometimes for the same thing, but to have the COG and to have Southwestern Regional Planning Commission for New Hampshire and to have our RPC and our DC, which sort of together form the similar thing, to have all of us in the room and then with federal agencies talking about something was kind of revolutionary. And I know that sounds kind of ridiculous because you and I all know that you go to Keene for this and you go to Brattleboro for that we live in a shared community that is defined more by kind of a cultural biosphere that we all share, but that is not the way jurisdictional stuff works. That's not the way planning works. And so it was a really momentous occasion to get together and say, we may have a lot of differences, but we know we have a lot in common. And we have this closure in common because actually it turns out that almost as many jobs in Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Vermont will be lost. And actually the whole narrative so far has been about what will happen to Vermont. And so let's sort of try to expand that. So the entire thing that I'm sort of trying to point out is that we started to do is have these conversations about looking ahead and saying this plant could go away and what could we replace it with and what do we have in common with our neighbors and how could we find a way to move forward together. Those were all pretty fundamentally good things that we can all agree on, but that don't just happen and that are kind of exciting things that the Ecovation Hub was born out of. And each of these things is really hard and took multiple years. And so we kind of were able to leverage with that partnership an interest from the federal government saying, great, let's do something new where we take this very tiny bit of language around the need for communities to plan for and react to closure and create a 3-state, a 3-region response. And you have about 5 seconds, to come up with that, because this is your funding cycle. And I'm not kidding. I wrote that grant. I was like, what do we do? So we leveraged the thing that we knew, which was the green building thing. We had some information on that, and the federal government had paid for that study. So like, that's legitimate enough. That's great. And we got together all the people who had been involved in that, and kind of from sort of green building and energy stuff in the area. And we worked out an application that to the EDA, the Economic Development Administration, which is Commerce, and we leveraged some of the VY closure money, and then partnered with Building Green, which is Alex Wilson's organization, to do this application. Included some other things, including a study that would look at all of the planning documentation for all the counties and to find the alignment. So there's some other stuff that's unrelated to Ecovation that's super important and still fundamental. But the Ecovation Hub was really built out of that. It was built out of that sort of like, what's going to be the response, and it has to be 3 region. That was really great. It was actually a great thing for the federal government to say, like, you have to keep walking that walk and talking that talk, and so we did. And so what happened is it basically brought in funding to have us spend about 1.5 years on a variety of different action teams and studies and different groups of people sort of getting together to kind of just, a lot of it was daylighting what that meant. What does it mean to have a lot of green building stuff? What does it mean to have a lot of knowledge? Like, what is going on at Antioch, and how does that relate to what's happening at Keene State? And how could that better relate to each other, but also become something that is not just really pretty cool and special, but like of national prominence to move forward, community resilience and planning. And so we, made a lot of progress in sort of understanding it and daylighting it. And now we're kind of in that phase of, all right, what can we build on and what's next? And the obvious constraints are not just funding. The constraints are leadership and capacity among human beings and organizations. There's only so much time that any people like us have in our day, and we're usually carving it out of other projects. And we kind of have to go with a mix of what there's already sort of some bandwidth for, but we really work hard with the leadership team to spend time looking beyond that all the time. So not just responding, yeah, it's great, there's solar stuff happening and we could move towards that, but that doesn't, I kind of made notes about my criteria for how I focus on Ecovation Hub things. And one of the first one is that it needs to be trying to do something that someone else isn't doing. We need to be thinking about what is a unique and substantive opportunity that will not just be happening on its own, and we can partner with and take credit for it, and that's great. But that's not really the point of what we were trying to do. It's like, what won't happen if we don't work hard to bring something new and special together? We've set up ourselves a really hard task in doing that, but it's kind of important because the other thing is that if we don't identify opportunities that represent our local potential niche, so specialized knowledge, a specialized approach to something, it won't create something that we can leverage to become a real advantage. I mean advantage in all different kinds of ways. It could be economic, could be cultural, it could be in terms of building collaborations, so that's why it's kind of slow and arduous. I think the other thing is, I will just say that my experience with the Ecovation Hub just bears out what I think is really important for people to understand in rural economic development, which is that a lot of the current wisdom about startups and innovations and initiatives really assumes that there will be a great idea and a great leader, or the right leadership and the resources, and they're around, and you just have to sort of help them find each other. And that's just not what it's like in rural economic development. It's like, okay, hold on to that. Hopefully it doesn't go away while you're trying to get this going. And so the juggling was a perfect thing. It just is like that. And you're just like, don't drop any of these balls when we get them all going, but we can do it. But it really takes a lot of care and relationship and facilitation and thought and staying focused on what is kind of unique and special, because there's a lot of stuff that's great about us that isn't really different from a lot of other places, and so we can celebrate it, but we can't leverage it to become something that will become jobs or help farmers or foresters. And so I'll get specific on that later on, potentially, if there's time, but I'll turn it over to Sarah.
That's sort of a good segue in terms of talking about where we see it going, because I came in sort of at the end, towards the end of the first year of the Ecovation Hub's process with the big fancy consultants. And what I saw as someone who was coming into that experience sort of at the tail end of that development work was the byproduct of what happens when you bring people outside the region into a region who don't understand exactly who lives here, what our resources are like, what the story of this place is, and you watch them try to apply their template for how to do development work to a region that they haven't bothered to necessarily dig down into the guts of and understand. And it meant looking at, in particular, a green banking development project that just was like, how is that even going to actually work here? that seems like maybe it would work in San Francisco, but it doesn't have anything to do with these 3 rural, relatively poor counties. So as we've sort of winnowed away the chaff of consultant ideas and sort of tried to redefine what our mission and our vision statement is for the organization, we really see ourselves as, I like to call us, the green business yentas of regional economic development. We're really matchmakers. What we're doing is utilizing our intimate knowledge of our region and the people who are at play here and the resources that we have and the businesses that already exist, so that when an outside, more moneyed economic entity comes in and says, hey, I have this development project I want to site in Franklin County, but I want to make sure that I'm using local businesses to flesh out all of the like supply side of what I'm doing, or to only contract with local contractors to actually physically build the thing that I'm going to build. We are the people that have that list of resources and can matchmake between all of those businesses, because at the end of the day, if there's anything that our region's about, it's about personal relationships. People in rural communities are responsible to one another in a way that they're not in urban environments, because no matter how much you disagree with Doug up the street, if there's an environmental disaster and his house is flooded out, you're not calling FEMA you're not waiting, you're helping each other. And part of the Ecovation Hub's original vision too was around disaster preparedness in the face of climate change. So I think that narrative is something that's really important to everyone on the leadership team, in terms of thinking about what we do. And we're really storytellers. And we're not going to be able to effectively market our region to people outside of it unless we have a clear sense of what our value proposition is as a community. And then also, we're not going to be able to find the right partners for our region if we don't have a strong sense of who we are and don't have an elevator pitch for Franklin County, Cheshire County, and Windham County in Vermont as to why, a cross-laminated timber company from Norway should really be thinking about working with us here to develop green housing. So we're in a phase now of really sort of repositioning ourselves as a connector, and we're less focused on some of the earlier efforts of the hub projects, which were sort of spread out, and we weren't really sure, are we going to have action teams dedicated to each one of these sectors of green business development, and they're going to actually be coming up with projects that people are going to do. And it seems clear that what we really need more of is the marketing and the storytelling and the connecting for what's already here. As anyone who lives in an area that doesn't have broadband knows, basic things like that aren't considerations for people who don't know our region, but we know that it's hard to know what's around all the time because, half of it doesn't have internet. And I used to be on the Shelburne Falls Business Association board, and even just organizing things like Moonlight Magic or the events that happen was a real struggle because Bob doesn't use a computer. He's the one that has 80 years of notes about this one event, but he's only available on Tuesdays, and you physically have to go to his house and meet him and get all of his papers out of his office. And that is where we live. And if you're a developer from Boston or a consultant from California, you don't know that about here. And people aren't going to want to work with you because you don't know that. So
yeah, and another thing that I think that we just have to really acknowledge that we are in, I feel blessed to live in Greenfield and that there is green in Greenfield, but like the proportion of like age cohorts in this room, it really tells a story about what we're dealing with. Like, we're dealing with a situation where there are too few young people who are at the beginning of a career who can sort of own and execute a new vision. And so, you know, I would say one of the things that I loved about the Ecovation Hub going into it was sort of the vision for really a holistic, sort of integrated, economic and livable, resilient community. But we didn't come out with a different vision, because we were also dealing with a, you know, demographically determined cultural outcome. You know, is that it was done by a bunch of mature mid to late career and retired people. And there, so I think of this as a slow process that's having to, you know, the vision that will lead an Ecovation Hub forward will really have to be of, for, and by whoever's going to really be living it and implementing it. And we're in kind of a slow, soft turnover, you know, to you guys. I mean, you guys, not me. Like, I'm just in the middle of Gen Xer, but that's really important, because without a critical mass of people for whom that 20 and 30 and 40 and 50 year horizon is the reality, we're not quite ready to sort of tip that scale. And I think what we need to do is kind of lay that groundwork. And I always think of sort of the analogy of, you know, there's a lot of really important social change that happened in the 60s, but the groundwork was laid for 20 and 30 years, you know, by the silent generation, by people who were building the kind of infrastructure of different movements. And that really helped things be ready to sort of tip culturally. And I feel like we have to be patient and kind of thorough and, you know, inclusive in the best ways of being sort of comprehensive and thoughtful and allowing for complexity. Having said that, I'm going to tell you two specific things just to make, you know, so I don't make it too often. So, you know, again, for me, I work for an economic development agency. My job is to sort of try to think about how to bring money into situations, and also to try to figure out, like, what's a thing we could scale, a problem we could solve that creates new opportunities for people who are here. And so there's a mass timber network. Mass timber refers not to Massachusetts timber, it refers to heavy stuff. So it can be big panels, it can be cross-laminated timber, massive, it can be timber frame. There's a mass timber network in Vermont that's actually really great and relates very much.
Do people know what cross-laminated timber is in this room? Would people like?
We'll talk about that. Oh yeah, that's good. You'll get to do that one as well. Yes, no, really. So,
yes.
Yeah.
You're losing me completely. I don't know what you want from us, or what your goal is for this workshop, because I'm following your discussion with each other, but I'm not feeling connected with you, and I wondered, is there some way that we can engage with you around this topic?
Oh, yeah. We were planning on sort of giving you this is the background portion for people who haven't read absolutely everything that the Ecovation Hub has ever done. So we're sort of letting you get an understanding of what our vision for the project is and what we've been working on. And then the second half of the presentation is a dialogue and questions. Yep. Yeah.
So I'm just going to give you something specific. Hopefully it'll make this easier too. So a project came forward that was, we had potential to take a look at an existing building project that was, first of all, an example of just what we're talking about. It's a low-income housing project that's being built in Brattleboro, and it will have housing for formerly homeless folks, as well as a variety of family housing in different kinds of units. It's going to be beautiful, and the Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust is choosing to do a passive house. Right, so this is an example of, this is what we're like in this area. We have this commitment to and this knowledge to do something like a low-income housing project that's going to be 4 or 5 stories high, passive house, meaning it will basically be no impact on the environment, right? It's going to have solar and incredible insulation and all these things, which is awesome. We took a look at that project and we said, well, what if we try to figure out where local wood belongs? Because that project right now is going to be built only with things that come from somewhere else. It's going to be built with a lot of concrete and steel. And we know that we could reduce the embodied energy. We know that we could get things that we grow here, trees we grow here, somehow into that building to replace some of the plywoods and things that would go in there. So we worked with the Vermont network, and I sort of, I'm on this team. We proposed this, and it was accepted. And so we worked with Stevens and Associates out of Brattleboro, who have some wood building expertise, and did kind of a parallel study to identify where could those products go, what those products look like, and what would the economic benefit be to local producers. And we found basically, for a ceiling structural product that frankly small sawmills can produce. I mean, we have a lot of sawmills that are going out of business because there's no demand for what's coming off of these kind of relatively small forestry holdings, even largish ones. And so creating something that would be a value-added product that would be of benefit to landowners, to folks who cut down trees and do things with those trees. Obviously we'd like them to do that sustainably. That's not the question is there's not really any market for most of the product coming off of their forests. There's not a firewood market, there's not a pulpwood market. So we looked at that, and it was about $150,000 worth of product just for that one building, which if you spread that out across, 10 farms, I mean, that would be a massive, massive benefit to the bottom line of, 10 different foresters and sawmill operators in the area. So that's like a real number for us. And we weren't able to implement that in this project. The timeline was impossible, but what was great is to be working with a foundation, working with Wyndham Windsor, who said, wait, all we would have to do on the next project is like raise another $150,000, and we could have done that too. And that was sort of the point of it, was to identify what's the opportunity, how would this benefit local producers who are struggling in the face of really massive shifts in terms of wood product markets, and how could we basically bridge that gap next time to do something really cool. And then there's a whole parallel project to that where I work with someone who is developing sort of the product testing to make sure that's safe and building codes can accept it. So that's the kind of stuff that we're talking about, taking something we already know how to do pretty well and saying, where's the opportunity to make this of more benefit and part of a kind of a better, a more sustainable economic system, and and tangibly have projects that advance those goals. So. Yeah, so CLT.
So cross-laminated timber is a relatively new forestry product that people are really excited about as a building material. One of the newest buildings at UMass, the new John Olver building, is made out of CLT. And what makes it exciting is that it's stronger than steel in terms of tensile strength. It's sustainably produced. It's beautiful. And because it utilizes you don't need old growth timber to make it. It's a really sustainable alternative to a lot of traditional forestry materials. And where it's really taken off or took off first in the United States was on the West Coast in the Pacific Northwest, where producing it for large-scale building projects has sort of single-handedly revitalized a lot of smaller logging communities and timber communities. So I started reading about this and just nerded out on it like a year ago, and started thinking about the New England forestry industry, and like as we stop producing paper and as smaller sawmills, as John was talking about, are closing, like what is going to step in and replace that product? And I was like, oh, well, this maybe. We have better studies now that say that some of the wood that we grow here could actually be used for certain CLT applications. Because initially things weren't looking so good in terms of like traditional hardwoods that we have here and CLT manufacturing. But there are wraparound industries, like there are different types of CLT products that could be produced here that aren't being produced here. That have sort of started to come into the market. And then there's also design work and finish work and housing applications for some of it that could really be a niche market that New England could like seize on. So part of the way that works in terms of the Ecovation Hub is when people who aren't from here come or interested in looking for a place that has a lot of affordable manufacturing capable real estate, which we have tons of because all of our closed factories and manufacturing sites for the last big industrial era that we had, that are want to buy something here but aren't sure of like, am I going to have access to transportation? Is there going to be a community of workers that have engineering training that are used to manufacturing, who could like come in onto the site and like learn these new applications? Are there truckers? Are there people who have that background? So we sort of have both a shovel-ready workforce. We have educational resources here, because especially in the 5 college region that are unlike other areas, and in southern Vermont and southern New Hampshire. And it's our role as the hub when those people, for like, say you're a Brooklyn developer who wants to like buy an old factory in Orange and set up some sort of CLT manufacturing facility, we're the people that they come to and say, hey, who do I talk to? And then that gives us the opportunity to say, well, you need to know this person, this person, this person, and this person. And unlike Amazon coming and building their new facility in your community, the hub is ensuring that the money goes to the people who already live here, and it's supporting people with knowledge and resources who are already here working in the community instead of bringing in outside expertise and assuming that the financial benefit that we're all going to see is in the form of like $11 an hour coffee shop jobs at all the coffee shops that spring up to support the fancy people who moved here, which I clearly have feelings about. So that's another way that the hub engages in that work. And part of our interest in meeting with you guys and having this workshop is because the initial projects that we've seen that have really taken off have both been in Vermont and New Hampshire. One of the major things that came out of the original Ecovation Hub was the Knowledge Consortium, which is really sort of housed at Antioch University in New Hampshire, and is sort of the educational arm of the Ecovation Hub project, where the workforce that we want to develop in our region around green industry is networking with one another, and there's a clear educational path from places like GCC into a 4-year program designed to produce like green engineering students and future farmers and food and farm systems students. And
there's also sort of getting into tiny Alex Wilson, where he will be talking about sort of his collaboration building green and resilient design institute with Keene State architecture and design, tiny homes for the homeless, and really looking at ecologically sustainable, but also obviously really resilient on a whole other bunch of levels, design that he's doing with that college. So that's sort of a set of initiatives leveraging a bunch of knowledge. And what I like to think about it is there's a lot of great stuff that we identified early on. It was like, but so what? Like, how does that come together? How do we add up to more than just, the sum of our parts? And also, like, where does that go? Like, how does this, it's nice that we build really beautiful, sustainable houses for people who come to have a second home here, but like, so what? Like, what is that doing? What are we doing to apply that knowledge to create something that's more, not just impactful here, but that actually like helps accelerate change and good things out in the world? And so that's, that's part of the fun of the wood building stuff, because there's a massive change going on in terms of building codes and acceptability of and embrace of wood as part of structures for replacing and reviving places, higher density places. And so there's a lot of wood building going on in Boston, and to be honest, for me the big pressure on the back of my neck all the time is like what's happening is that's being met largely by things that are going on in Quebec, where there's been a tremendous amount of innovation investment, and literally those trucks are rolling by us in kind of a wood building revolution in which we aren't really taking part meaningfully yet. And so that's just one example of like, we're literally on the way. There are import benefits for them of doing more value added processes here and more engineering, but like we're all kind of running to catch up. So Maine's a little ahead of that, having kind of thought their way through this several years ago. But that's, the other thing I wanted to say is to be positive about this, that, as we wait for the Farm Bill that Congressman McGovern talked about, one of the things we hope to see in the Farm Bill is a change in the Northern Borders Commission structure to encompass like all of Vermont and New Hampshire. And there's a similar amount, there's a lot of investment and push coming through Massachusetts, with some real investment in studies and understanding opportunities in sustainably harvest wood building. And so there's a lot of stuff that's kind of happening and potentially poised to happen. So we could see just some very exciting things happening here that have been kind of taking off in the Northwest for a long time, that are different and regionally appropriate and regionally scaled. But
which brings me back to a little bit to like where I was sort of steering us towards in terms of interacting with this group. Is that until I joined the Ecovation Hub leadership team, like Franklin County in particular didn't have a really strong presence in terms of participation in the hub, and all of the stuff that the hub is doing is my personal like pet nerd jam. So I was really excited to join, but I'm really interested in hearing from you now that you've sort of heard our spiel, where you see the opportunities in Franklin County for this sort of resource connector. What projects are you working on, or areas are you involved in that you see a lack of connection between? Because there's so much good stuff going on, but it's really easy in a really rural county that's underfunded and under-resourced monetarily to feel like it's all happening in silos. Like, and you've got a little grant over here, I've got a little grant over here. We might be working on similar things, but we don't know about one another because we each have our like $5,000 and we're just like, oh, I've got to do this one thing my grant wants me to do.
Yeah, don't be limited by the examples we gave. I mean, I'm, biodigesters and wood heat and, I mean, whatever. I mean, define it as you wish, but yeah.
I have a question because in Franklin County we had a lot of interested people in protecting our forests. Mm-hmm. And so it's to the point where it's protecting our forests to the point where we can't cut. Right. So I would like to have a better conversation to help the public understand the sustainable practices that would be around using forest products in these small woodlots where nobody's managing them. And I'm for that. There's a middle road. And how are you dealing with that?
Yeah, so that's something that I get really involved in because I do have professional time that I can dedicate to that. So I spend a lot of time going to things where foresters are, as well as conservation. And there's a great area of agreement that's sort of this light touch, don't ask, don't tell, that we're not performing the stewardship that our tax abatement claims that we are kind of realm. And there's a lot of ignorance. And I talk I see foresters at conferences who toe the line and are kind of like, yep, no, it's all great. And then they quietly will be like, oh my God, like everybody thinks that cutting down trees is the apocalypse. And that's like, I have to do that to make the trees healthy. So there is a need for that conversation, because understanding that, a tended forest is a healthy forest, and we are losing foresters because we're not doing enough of that. It was sort of the irony of the very people who know how to do that don't get enough, aren't paid well enough, there aren't enough ways to pay them to do that kind of stewardship, and it's ridiculous. And I spent a lot of time with some of the worst and some of the best in terms of practices, and the folks who are implementing really great sustainable forestry are able to do it for very wealthy landowners, but there isn't really a viable living for them to make doing it for everybody else. So that's sort of the irony. But they see a lot of potential, and they can explain to you pretty quickly, like, if I can let that tree become something that's worth $20 a board foot by taking care of it really well, as opposed to just good enough for pulp or firewood, it's good for all of us, and
you don't have to convince
right.
me.
No, but I mean the math. But I think that having that education would be so helpful, because I think for folks to understand the math of how we kind of reinvest in the people who are knowledgeable and have that talent, and then sort of what that produces economically, which allows us to keep doing that and allows people like them to practice. I mean, the foresters tell the best. Yeah. So can we put on that conference with Green Greenville? Because it's also really fun. I mean, this is
that we actually, just to in terms of practical application of what you just said, one of our goals for the upcoming year, we're about to have a board retreat, and one of our goals for the upcoming year is to generate a schedule of events like that, where we have community conversations. And because I came up with the agenda, of course, the first conference I'm proposing is a CLT forestry conference in Franklin County, where we get people from the carpenters unions and the building unions who would need to who are in favor of new things. Yes. Especially if it gives them a corner on a market that has been largely untapped, and we can become leaders and
absolutely. I mean,
industry experts.
To be clear, there are iron workers who won't touch the CLT because they're not really they really can't. They don't have training on it, so they won't work on a building where you replace the steel with wood because they shouldn't and they can't. We don't really have a great process to give them a certification and basically make it something where they don't have to worry and the construction manager doesn't have to worry. So there's a lot of boring policy and technical things that have to be solved, but it's not because we can't do it. It's not because people don't want to. I mean, those iron workers want to work on those buildings. They just, they just don't want to. And they don't want to be liable for doing something wrong. So
we definitely are interested in planning on putting on just that sort of conference where people could come together, and there would be a lot of demystifying of who needs what are the current obstacles, and who are the people that need to know each other in terms of mass, like Western mass forestry, in order to really create a market and a new economy for all those goods and services.
Yeah.
Is it going to be, where is that going to be located, in Vermont or here?
Oh, here in Franklin County. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I was talking to our outgoing chamber director about it, and she's very excited, and hopefully whoever replaces her will be equally thrilled about listening to me talk about wood.
And I work in Brattleboro, but I live here, so if it's on the weekend, I want it here.
Next question.
So my question is about food from forests.
Yeah.
Trees are a great source of nuts. Understories are great sources of berries, roots, vines, all sorts of great things. Is there anything that's being done to address the resource of food from forests?
There was a whole action team that's sort of dedicated to permaculture and forest-based products, and that's, what is its name?
Jim Brzezino?
No, I'll think of the name, and it'll come to me in a little bit. But but I think that it actually rolls into the forestry discussion, because the reality is that there has to be an understanding that it's not just about removing timber stock. It's about having conservation areas and cultivation areas, and that's sort of the bigger conversation about the wood resource. So there were discussions, and there's a group of people who were working on a whole bunch of things related to that, but I think the bigger concern that I have is the Ecovation Hub has to keep those conversations together. These things aren't at odds with each other. These things are all sort of complementary. I mean, the reality is, if you're managing, forestry parcels, you are not managing them all for one thing. You're managing some of them for just, conservation. It might be a, wild, the best practice is you would have your songbirds fields over here, and you're going to have your sort of maturing timber lot of hardwoods over here. So this is part of the bigger picture conversation. And again, the action teams are about doing specific projects, and that's great. And I only get involved in the wood building ones. But the hub's importance is to sort of make sure we bring all these conversations back together all the time. So like that conversation has to be at the forestry conference, you know what I mean? Like not off on the side. And it was one of the things that I think got too fractured towards the end, and that we really need to bring it back together. By the end of the Ecovation Hub sort of process with the consultants, there was a lot happening in all these different areas. We didn't really have a mechanism to keep bringing it back together. So hence our sort of desire, or kind of anxiety about getting a conference where we do that. Because I think that's I can't do that, and I'm not looking to replace, anyone's action in an area that they're specialized in, but I want to make sure you're talking to everybody all the time. That's the thing that we can add value doing, so.
I'm a little concerned that everything's very segmented in what I'm hearing, that there are parcels of land for conservation, then there's another block of land for timber production, then there's another land for wildlife and understory. You can't have understory without the trees, and so I'm confused about the techniques of managing, of forest management, and I'm wondering if you could speak to that.
Sure. I mean, I can't, because I'm not a forester. I mean, I'm talking about what I've heard foresters say, so I don't think, that's not, it would be great to have a conference where we bring those people forward to talk about how do you both get great material for CLTs and also keep improving habitat and also do other things, but that is not what we talk about. That's not what we do all day.
You don't pay attention to that?
I absolutely pay attention to it, but I'm not an expert in it, so it's not something.
Matter. I mean, I'm just wondering what your personal opinion is.
Oh, I mean, we can talk about it.
I mean, my personal opinion is that we have a small number of people implementing best practices, and it's to the detriment of their ability to make a living. So that's really my concern, and that there is there's like one of the best forestry companies in central Vermont is only staying alive because a private investor is boosting them, and they're holding on to a sustainable certification that the state has let go of. I mean, we're not really investing in the things we say we care about, and that certification makes it possible for them to sell their products for more money. And so like that, the structural stuff really matters, and I trust them to do what they do in the forest. I really do. I mean, they're beautiful. I mean, what they produce, but
I think your concern sort of cuts across all of the sectors that we've been talking about in terms of forestry, and then food and farm,
absolutely.
and especially farming. And to bring it back to what the hub sees its role as Jen was just talking about, is making sure that the conversations that need to happen about all of those things aren't happening in little separated, isolated groups. Because what we're really facing across all of these different sectors of economic development in our region is a lack of succession planning, and the simple fact that you can't, we've arrived in a place where it's not really sustainable or possible or feasible in our current economic climate to do just one thing and make a living anymore. You can't just farm. You can't just cut down trees. You need to have diversified streams of income that are all related to that original thing that you were doing. And what we see our strength as is providing people with resources and the right people who have the right knowledge to help walk them through those transitions. So the hub itself isn't going to come out to your farm and give you a succession plan for transitioning away from being just a dairy farmer to being a cheesemaker or doing agritourism or, you know, having a goat petting zoo, whatever it is that's going to get you through all the 4 seasons. But what we are going to do is say, oh, here are all the people you need to talk to. Here is this company that specializes in loans that help people like go through this transitional process and will help get you the funding for it. Here are all these grants that you can apply for. Here's the person that can write the grant for you. We're knowledge brokers, connecting people with those resources and sort of simplifying and streamlining how you get that information. So instead of you, the farmer who's overwhelmed with, you know, trying to figure out how you're going to make nut butter while you're growing hazelnut trees, you come to us and we say, here, we did all this legwork and all of the like searching and all of the interneting for you.
Or we know the person who did. I mean, that's the other thing, is like, we're not trying to be the all to be able to end all. I think I went to a beautiful session that was put on by Richard Burkfield, who runs Monadnock Rose and Food Connects, which is like a food distribution 2-state Vermont, New Hampshire organization. That's like they're kind of a lot of like CISA PV Grows kind of space they operate in, making sure smaller producers are connecting with customers like schools, so that this farmer can sell to, you know, folks in their community, and that's not something that the private sector was sort of taking care of, right? And so they are a nonprofit that does this great food distribution stuff. He put together a session with all these food producers, and one theme that none of us expected to come out of it was how much each of them is using technology to be able to actually make a living doing what they're doing. And that's a common problem that I face in Vermont, is that people think when I talk as an economic developer about needing internet and broadband and, you know, and cell service, that I'm trying to make sure everybody, you know, has an office job and they go home and do more work. I'm like, you're not, it's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the guy who is still running his grandfather's, great-great-great-grandfather's dairy farm, probably isn't making a living at it, and so he's had to basically do some mechanization of the work that he does so that he can go to another job to keep the farm going. You and I don't love that, but right now that's keeping the farm going. The fact that that cow can walk in there and get milk, and he can check on his cell phone while he's at the job that's paying his, you know, for his farm to stay going. Like, we have to care about those things, and all the way up the food chain. And I think that there's not enough sort of attention to these system pieces, and I'm not the person to solve that, but I know who the legislator who is, you know. So that's really, I think that's an important, it's these problem solvings and facilitations. It's also this question of scale, you know, that we see some opportunities that individually no one's going to necessarily take on, you know, but as a group we get together and we talk about it. We say, you know, like, that could be really cool for this region, and that's terrifying, but together we could try to figure out how to get that kind of a factory here, how to get that kind of testing facility here. And it's something that none of these little counties alone could try to do, and that's really what, you know, we hope for. And not that the small things don't matter, but there's some really cool big things that I think Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts together could take on, because we have more capacity together, and also because we are rewarded for behaving that way. And there are some things we could ask for from the federal government that none of us alone are going to get, but together we might actually have a shot. So, you know, it's sort of about being louder. Maybe that's the simplest way to understand that. So.
But then also, again, art's so big that they become non-specific to our region. And
no, don't want to change. Yeah,
because that's really important too.
Yeah.
If you're the person going to all the small farms and talking to them about succession planning, you know.
Oh my gosh.
You better have dirt on your shoes.
When I did the numbers on the sawmill stuff and the forestry sector a couple of years ago, I mean, one of the things I do is I just do research and I push it up to our legislators just to be like, here's why the time matters. This isn't like a thing that's just like sitting around until we feel like solving it. Like, this is a moving thing that's getting worse while we're not solving it. You know, I had that moment of like, you know, when I was a child in the 70s and they put the ad on the TV with the Native American with the litter swirling around his feet, and I had that like, oh my God, this is its own environmental apocalypse because the people who are the stewards of the land are disappearing much faster than we're noticing, much less doing anything about it. So I think that's, you know, this is things going away are quiet. Building them up is super hard. But I think together we kind of give each other just the courage to sort of talk about it and pay attention to it and find some opportunities to push back on that. So,
other people have questions? We've talked a lot.
Yes, we do. We get together, we talk. Like, we talk a lot like this all the time.
But we are, I mean, this is a lot of information to digest, and it's a lot of big picture concept style systems thinking.
That's the idea.
So our hope is that now that you know that this exists, when we do start publishing a calendar of events, that especially the ones in Franklin County, that you feel empowered to come and participate in those conversations, which will be thematic, smaller conversations, or like a conference like the Timber Conference we're talking about doing, where you can come and meet other people in the area who have similar economic concerns or who are in need of something like a sustainable business matchmaker. Like, you have a jam company and your kids hate jam and don't want to take it over. There might be somebody coming out of like a food and farm systems program at UMass that's really interested in taking over a small local business but doesn't understand how that process works. We're the people who are going to get you in a room talking to each other. Yeah, so that those things can sort of happen organically, and we convince, you know, our young people to not all move to Brooklyn. Nobody's moving to Brooklyn anymore. That was like that was like 10 years ago. But
when I was your age, no one admitted to living in Brooklyn. Sorry. Yes.
Wherever they're moving now, Asheville. I don't know.
I'm a former retired librarian, and I firmly believe in the power of the written word. And so there have been some marvelous books written about the farming situation, where what is the next generation going to be doing about the farms that are the farmers are aging. I think there needs to be a book interviewing foresters, telling us their stories, because we don't know those stories.
I agree, and a movie and a reality show, and I mean, I went to the Vermont Forest Industry Summit, which is the first one they've ever had. They had it this year. I mean, I could have sat there all day and just listened to them, because they're telling like a story about a place that you know, but you don't know the way they know it, you know. So it's like this incredible. It's amazing, and they also are so knowledgeable. I mean, they understand stuff about sort of how a stand of trees that looks like this versus looking like that translates into different things, as far as, you know, board feet this or firewood that, or conservation.
Yeah.
Oh God, and they're all adorable. So there's that too. So it doesn't hurt.
We could start with a series of articles and then see what grows from there. I used to work in publishing too, so we could probably make that happen.
There are film festivals.
It's true. We have a planner of one of them sitting here in the room.
Yeah, so with film festivals, we could put that on the list, the menu.
Yeah.
Of what you might make a film about.
Yeah,
That would be super fun. That sounds so much more fun than writing grants, which is what I feel like I do all the time.
Yeah, it's way more fun than writing grants.
Good to know.
Yes.
I'll ask a question that's pretty broad, but do you deal with urban forestry at all? Because in my new role in the council, I've found that like the older generation that runs this town doesn't care about trees at all, and it's a thing that we've had to push back on a lot. And so far, my pushback has just been planning of like how to convince people, and then how to get a newer generation in that sees the value in trees. Because to me, trees in an urban environment like downtown Greenfield is like one of the easiest things that you can do to increase real estate values and quality of life. But there's
air
like
quality and
storm runoff, for so many different things. But the turnaround time is a little bit too long for people who are like thinking from one budget cycle to the next. have you dealt, or do you
So that's-
know like urban forestry
You're
experts?
not, I mean, you're, so just, full like, I'm a planner and, I don't do land use stuff at all, but I mean, one of the things I loved about the Ecovation Hub sort of birth was that it really came out of a vision that was very much a sort of resilient and sustainable and healthy kind of vision just for Brattleboro, which had kind of preceded the Ecovation Hub, and that really is still, that kind of concept is still embedded in it, of like places and communities and interconnected communities that are not only healthy and sustainable, but also that are models for what other communities can be. And it's a really, if Stephen were here, he'd be speaking more to that, because that's been a big piece for him of like what do we sort of implement here as far as homes, neighborhoods, community scale. Antioch is a big part, does that a lot. That's kind of what their degrees and their conferences. So their knowledge consortium piece, the Ecovation Hub, is very focused on that. But also that's sort of part of the vision of 20 years hence. And the Ecovation Hub is a place where people sort of like come and like see it in action, like how do Keene and Greenfield, but also like smaller places really sort of implement a balance between sort of conservation and connectivity and and that's really embedded throughout it, and harder to talk about, but definitely part of the culture of the Ecovation Hub. So
Yeah, and I think it's something that we would definitely be interested in bringing to the conference that we're planning,
That's what I
and
was gonna
yeah,
suggest.
making sure that
Just have a
that's
breakout session
yeah
about it.
that's part of the conversation, because we do have people working within the hub that are doing it in other states who could really sell people on why it's important and get them thinking beyond the next 5 years.
and thinking about how at community scales when we really have impact. I mean, it's nice to build a nice home that doesn't consume energy, and that's awesome, but it's really what happens when entire neighborhoods or communities are transformed is when we actually start to turn the meters backwards, and I mean, I don't have to tell Nancy that, but I mean, I think this is ultimately it is hard to talk about. We have a lot of knowledgeable, smart people in this area who know how to do smaller or individual projects. What we don't have is sort of enough capacity and leadership around implementing and funding larger, like multiples of those things, and planning at community scale for that. And that's just a gap. I think that's a gap that is going to be filled by a generation of, frankly, entrepreneurs and planners and activists who are like your age, and that's not so. They were missing from the table because they literally aren't here. So we're doing an Ecovation Hub plan for the future. Kind of you set a place at the table for the folks who aren't here yet to really carry this forward, and just knowing it, like that's, I don't think that was a lack of welcome, but it's just like the demographics are what they are.
Well, I also think too, when you're telling those stories, a lot of it, to go back to the importance of the written word and the spoken word,
Yes.
it depends on how it's being communicated too, because it's not just that they're not interested or don't see the value in trees, it's that you haven't found the value of the tree that is salient to them. And making sure that you're not creating conversations that are exclusionary around those things, where if part of what we have is a succession planning issue, making sure that the conversations that are happening are intergenerational for that reason. Like, we all need clean air. Like, climate change isn't something that happens in a bubble only to middle class and poor people. Like, everybody is part of that conversation. I feel like that conversation has shifted even more.
You're nicer than I am. I'm much more like, just
I
deal
know.
with the people who
I know.
understand.
I know.
And,
I'm more like, no,
you're much more
everybody under the
inclusive. I'm
tent
like,
still.
people don't get it.
I just think there's a way to have those
know.
conversations where it has meaning to all groups of people, because everybody needs certain resources, everybody needs certain things to live. And
Totally
it's just
so.
a matter of how you frame that conversation to make sure that people understand, oh, trees are important not just because this hippie kid likes trees, but it makes my house more valuable at this specific dollar amount, and here's how the value goes up, and here's a graph about it. So
Yeah, and I think that's true for all of it. I mean, there's this interpretive need, and so when we talk about, when someone's like, well, why do I care that people who used to haul wood out of the forest and sell it to pulp mills or sell it for firewood now are leaving it there because it cost them more to remove it from the woods than it did. It's like, well, if you care about conservation, here's why you care. If you care about that person's livelihood and that land staying conserved because it's if they don't make a living off of it, it may not. It may get sold for, whatever. That, I think you start to connect. You kind of have to cast around. Everybody cares about different things. We have some things we all claim to care about, like our children or whatever. But they're really there's a lot of different values to each of these things. So I don't think it's hard to sell. It's just that we can't. I think we actually can't pin anything on one particular. We just have to get people in by helping unpack all of the ways that these things are beneficial. It creates jobs. It creates economic value in a community. It keeps land stewarded. It keeps us improving our practices of stewardship. It creates beauty, and I never talk about the environmental benefits because I feel like they're so obvious and everyone knows them. So then people come after me and they're like, "Don't you care?" I'm like, "I care. I just think it's so obvious." But